Elena Morgan was 34 years old, but the weight she carried on her shoulders felt much older. Once, she had been a military linguist, trained to hear what others missed. The inflection in a tone, the hidden meaning inside a single word, the silence between sentences that revealed more than reports ever could. Yet for all her service, her father, Colonel Richard Morgan, never saw her gift as strength. To him, her work was nothing more than translator tricks, a phrase he used with a cold smirk that cut deeper than any insult from strangers. He had medals, stars, and polished shoes that clicked across marble floors. She had notebooks filled with words no one cared to understand. He believed victory came from guns and strategy, not from voices and languages. And in his eyes, Elena was a daughter who had wasted her life on whispers. What hurt Elena most was not his words, but the silence that followed them. The silence of a father who never acknowledged her worth, never asked what she had seen, and never listened to the truth she carried home from battlefields. She had saved lives with a single sentence, but at home she remained invisible. Forgotten, dismissed, and pushed aside, Elena had learned early that sometimes the hardest war to fight was not on foreign soil, but across the dinner table with the man who should have defended her first. Years had passed since Elena last stepped into the Pentagon. She had promised herself she would never return, not after the disgrace, not after her clearance was stripped away, not after the silence that followed. Yet now, summoned under urgent orders, she walked the cold marble halls once more, her plain blazer a quiet contrast to the uniforms polished to perfection around her. The war room was alive with tension. Screens glowed with satellite images and coded transmissions, voices murmured in clipped tones, and the air itself seemed to hum with restrained urgency. Elena took her seat at the long table, determined to remain unnoticed, just another consultant hidden in the background. But then her eyes fell on a familiar figure only a few seats away. Colonel Richard Morgan. Her father. He looked unchanged, back straight, ribbons gleaming, presence heavy with pride. To the others, he was a man of authority, a decorated officer whose opinion carried weight. But to Elena, he was the same man who had dismissed her voice as irrelevant, who had taken credit while letting her drown in silence. His jaw tightened when he saw her, but his expression never cracked. To him, she was still the daughter who had failed. To her, he was no longer father, only Colonel Morgan. In that moment, Elena realized the war room was not just filled with maps and missions. It was filled with ghosts, and one of them was seated right beside her. The war room fell silent as the heavy doors opened. General Jonathan Langford entered with a presence that needed no announcement. His uniform was immaculate, his stride measured, and though he spoke no greeting, the room seemed to realign around him. He sat at the head of the table, eyes sharp, scanning the gathered officers with the calm authority of a man who had seen both war and its cost. Without warning, Langford closed the folder before him and began to speak, not in English, not in Arabic, not even in the formal Dari most interpreters studied. His words rolled out in an obscure tribal dialect, raw and unpolished, the kind of speech carried by villagers whose voices rarely reached official records. It was the kind of language that lived in whispers, passed through generations, barely captured in textbooks. The room froze. Analysts exchanged confused glances, linguists frowned at their notes, and even the most seasoned officers looked unsettled. Colonel Morgan shifted uncomfortably, though his face remained fixed in its usual mask of confidence. Not a single person moved to respond. Except Elena. Her pulse quickened, but her voice was steady. She answered in the same dialect, her tone respectful yet certain, carrying the rhythm she had once heard in a small Afghan village when a mother spoke to calm her wounded son. The words flowed out of her like water remembered by stone. A long pause followed. Chairs creaked. Every pair of eyes in the room turned toward her. For the first time in years, silence did not diminish Elena, it revealed her. And in that silence, she saw the flicker of something rare on General Langford's face. Recognition. Elena had passed a test no one else even realized was happening. General Langford leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on Elena as if the rest of the room no longer existed. The silence stretched long enough to make even the most decorated officers shift uneasily. Finally, he spoke, not in Dari this time, but in English, his voice low, deliberate, carrying the weight of something more than mere acknowledgement. She is Aegis. The words cut through the air like a verdict. Several heads turned sharply, brows furrowed, whispers barely restrained. Aegis was not a name. It was a designation, a title reserved for a rare kind of operative. Not just a translator, not just an interpreter, but a guardian of intent. Someone who could hear what was meant, not merely what was spoken. Someone who could stop a war with a single sentence. Elena did not move. She kept her expression calm, though the word reverberated inside her like a bell she had long forgotten. She had heard it once before, years ago, in the shadows of a debriefing room, spoken quietly by a commander who told her she saw what others overlooked. She had thought it lost, buried with her career. And now, here it was again, resurrected by a general in front of the one man who had denied her worth all her life. Colonel Richard Morgan's face drained of color. His jaw tightened, his hands clenched against the polished table, but he said nothing. For once, the man who had always commanded the room sat in silence, humiliated not by words of accusation but by recognition he could not claim. Elena didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply breathed, steady and quiet, the way one does when finally seen. The war room no longer belonged to medals or titles. For that moment, it belonged to her. The word Aegis still echoed in Elena's ears when another memory surfaced. One far heavier than pride, one that clung to her like a shadow she could never escape. Samuel. Her younger brother had only been 21, full of restless energy and hesitant dreams. He wanted to study medicine, maybe become a field medic, maybe heal instead of fight. But their father had other plans. To Colonel Morgan, hesitation was weakness, and weakness was shameful. Samuel had no choice. Under the weight of his father's expectations, he signed the enlistment papers with trembling hands, and 2 days later he was gone. Elena remembered their last conversation. Samuel's voice had cracked, just as it had when they were children. "I'm not ready, Ellie," he had whispered. "I don't think I belong out there." She had tried to reassure him, but her words couldn't compete with their father's iron command. To the colonel, Samuel's fear was cowardice, and cowardice could not stain the Morgan name. 6 months later, Samuel's unit walked into an ambush in Helmand province. The report said it was a roadside bomb, wrong place, wrong time. But Elena had read the intercepted transmissions herself. A single word, mistranslated, had shifted the meaning of the message. What should have been a warning became silence. What should have saved them became their death sentence. She remembered staring at the debrief file, her chest tightening as she saw the inconsistencies. She had sent a memo, flagging the error. It disappeared. Her clearance was suspended soon after. And Samuel's name was etched into stone. Elena never forgave her father for pushing him into a uniform he didn't want to wear. But more than that, she could never forgive herself for not being able to protect him. Not with all the words she carried, not with all the languages she spoke. Samuel's death was not just a loss. It was the reminder that silence kills more surely than any bullet. Elena's love for languages began long before uniforms, before battlefields, before the Pentagon. As a child, she would sit cross-legged on the floor with an old radio pressed to her ear, scribbling strange syllables into the margins of her math homework. While other girls traced hearts around the names of schoolyard crushes, Elena traced the cadence of words she didn't yet fully understand. Pashto, Dari, fragments of voices carried across static. Her father dismissed it as a waste of time. Mumbling won't win you a future, he had scoffed once, catching her whispering foreign proverbs under her breath. To him, numbers and discipline were real. Words were fragile, weak. But her mother saw differently. Already frail, her voice often no stronger than a whisper, she still found the strength to lean in one evening when Elena was 12. Elena had been practicing a Dari phrase into her pillow, embarrassed when she realized she wasn't alone. But her mother only smiled faintly and said words that would shape her daughter's life forever. Whoever understands language understands war before it starts. It was the last full sentence her mother ever spoke to her before the illness claimed her voice for good. After that, the house grew quieter, the colonel retreating into his routines, his orders, his silence. But Elena clung to that memory, repeating it in her mind whenever doubt pressed too close. By 13, she was fluent in Dari and conversational in Pashto. She hid her notebooks behind coats in the hall closet, not out of shame, but to protect the one thing that felt truly hers. Each phrase she mastered was more than a word, it was a shield, a promise that one day, her voice would matter. Elena was 24 the first time her voice mattered more than any weapon. She had been attached to a Marine unit in Kabul, her role little more than an afterthought, the translator, the one they waved toward the back of convoys while real soldiers carried rifles and authority. To most of them, she was an accessory, useful only when locals refused to understand hand signals. That afternoon, the convoy stopped near a crowded market. The air was thick with dust and the smell of spices. Children darted between the stalls, and women bartered under tin rooftops. It seemed ordinary, almost peaceful, until a boy appeared. He couldn't have been older than 10. Barefoot, his face smudged with dirt, he clutched something metallic against his chest as he stepped into the open street. From the Humvee, it looked like a weapon. A corporal shouted, panic rising in his voice. Rifles snapped into position. Fingers tightened on triggers. In seconds, the entire market tilted toward tragedy. Elena didn't think. She reacted. Her voice tore through the chaos in a single phrase, shouted in a dialect so local, so specific, that the boy froze instantly. Kachaknist, botcha. His not smuggling. His just a child. The Marines hesitated. The boy lifted his hands, revealing not a weapon, but a dented cooking pot. Relief rippled through the street, fragile as glass. The rifles lowered, slowly, reluctantly. The boy blinked, then ran, vanishing between the narrow walls of the market. The incident lasted less than 20 seconds. No shots were fired. No blood was spilled. Later, the lieutenant filed a brief report. No incident. But Elena knew better. A single mistranslation, a single word unsaid, and that dusty street would have run red. That day, she understood something she never forgot. Translation was not about grammar or dictionaries. It was survival. Sometimes the right word came faster than the wrong bullet. The betrayal came not on a battlefield, but in a sterile debriefing room lined with polished wood and watchful eyes. Elena had submitted her translation with careful notes, nuances flagged, dialect markers underlined, a recommendation for secondary verification. She knew the stakes. A single word could move troops, shift borders, cost lives. She did her job with precision. But when the operation unraveled, wrong coordinates, wrong timing, soldiers lost, the blame came swiftly. The final report bore her name. The altered phrasing in the transcript was hers on paper, but not in truth. She recognized immediately that the words were not hers. The style, the cadence, even the orthography had been twisted. Someone had overridden her submission. Someone with authority. That someone was her father. Colonel Richard Morgan sat at the far end of the table, chest full of ribbons, posture unbreakable. He never looked at her as he cleared his throat and spoke. Specialist Morgan may have acted beyond her assigned capacity. A lack of field context could explain the error. His voice was measured, detached, the kind of tone that sounded more like fact than accusation. And just like that, the panel nodded. Pens scribbled. Her defense evaporated. Elena tried to speak. She showed her draft, her flagged concerns. But each time, he cut her off with the authority of rank. To the board, it was simple. A junior linguist had made a mistake. A decorated officer had confirmed it. Case closed. Her clearance was suspended. Her career dismantled. Her reputation reduced to a single black mark on an official file. When she walked out of that room, she left more than her uniform behind. She left the word father. From that day forward, he was only Colonel Morgan, a man who chose silence and self-preservation over truth and blood. And something inside Elena hardened, not into hatred, but into clarity. The man who should have protected her had used her as a shield. When the military stripped Elena of her clearance, her rank, and the uniform that had once defined her, she expected to feel empty. For a time, she did. The silence that followed her dismissal was suffocating. No orders, no missions, no sense of belonging. She lived in a small basement apartment outside Arlington, where the air always smelled faintly of mildew and soap. Forgotten by the institution she had served, Elena wondered if her voice would ever matter again. But then she found a flyer pinned to a community board. A local non-profit needed someone to teach English to Afghan refugee children. No credentials required, just patience and heart. She hesitated, then walked into a repurposed gymnasium the following morning. Folding chairs lined the walls. The lights flickered overhead. And waiting for her were 24 children whose lives had been carried across oceans in plastic bags. Some had lost fathers. Others had lost both parents. Many barely spoke at all, their eyes fixed on the windows as if still searching for what they had left behind. Elena began each class with something simple, a line of poetry written in both English and Dari. Rumi, Hulfez, Sadi, words that belonged to them long before they belonged to her. She read aloud in both languages, and for the first time in months, the children smiled. They giggled when her accent slipped, nodded solemnly when the meaning struck something deeper, and sometimes whispered their own verses when they thought she wasn't listening. Their poems reminded Elena of something she had almost forgotten, that words could be more than warnings or weapons. Words could be bridges. They could heal in places where bullets had only scarred. In that quiet gym, Elena discovered a new mission. No medals. No rank. No recognition. Only children learning to write their names in English, grinning as if they had just built a bridge no one could tear down. And for the first time since losing Samuel, Elena felt her voice had found a place it belonged. It was a Wednesday afternoon, the kind of day that felt small and ordinary. The heater in the rec center had broken again, and the children huddled in mismatched hoodies while Elena guided them through a poem about winter. She had just finished the last stanza when her phone buzzed. An unfamiliar Washington, D.C. number lit the screen. She ignored it. But then it buzzed again. And again. 3 times in 90 seconds. That was no accident. When class ended, Elena stepped outside into the brittle air and answered. "Ms. Morgan," a man's voice said, calm and steady, "I need 10 seconds. Then you can hang up." She didn't reply, only listened. And then he spoke the words. Baridar ma gazed kata mayad. Brother. Death comes from danger. Elena froze. It wasn't just Dari. It was their code, phrases whispered in a forgotten war zone, buried deep in memory. No one outside that field base should have known it. Her breath caught. "Who are you?" she asked. "Lieutenant General Jonathan Langford," came the answer. Elena's knees locked. She hadn't worn a uniform in years. "I'm not in service anymore." "This isn't a summons," Langford replied. "Not officially." He paused, then added, "It's a crisis, layered in 6 languages, manipulated across channels. We don't need another linguist. We need someone who can hear what isn't being said." Elena gripped the phone tighter. "You have hundreds of translators." "I don't need translators," he said evenly. "I need you." His tone carried no flattery, no plea. It was operational fact. For a long moment, Elena said nothing. Her exile had cost her everything, her career, her reputation, her family. But Langford's words reminded her of something she couldn't deny. In a world where mistranslations could kill, her silence was just another weapon. Finally, she exhaled. "When and where?" "Pentagon," he answered. "Top floor. Friday. 0600, side entrance." And before she could second-guess herself, he hung up. Elena stood there in the cold, phone pressed to her ear long after the line went dead, the sound of children's laughter echoing faintly from the gym behind her. She wasn't returning as a soldier. She was returning as something else, someone who listened when no one else dared. The Pentagon had not changed. The marble floors still gleamed, the walls still hummed with the quiet arrogance of power, and the war room still pulsed with urgency. But for Elena, every step inside felt heavier than the last. She hadn't walked these halls since the day they stripped her badge and clearance. Now she returned through the side entrance, escorted without ceremony, her plain clothes a quiet contrast to the sea of uniforms polished to perfection. The war room was already full when she entered, generals in their seats, analysts hunched over tablets, maps glowing on massive screens. And there, as if fate had arranged it, sat Colonel Richard Morgan. Her father. He turned slightly, eyes narrowing when he saw her. His posture remained rigid, his expression unreadable, but when she walked past to take her seat, He leaned close enough for only her to hear. "Still clinging to your little translator tricks," he murmured. Elena kept her gaze forward. She did not answer. Silence was her reply. General Langford began the briefing, his voice sharp and clear. Intercepted communications flickered across the screens, snippets of Dari, Pashto, Farsi, layered with coded anomalies. Analysts debated syntax. Linguists bickered over idioms. No one agreed on meaning, only that the chatter was urgent. Then Langford turned to Elena. "Initial impressions, Ms. Morgan." She inhaled once, steady, then stood. Her eyes scanned the text, not as scattered phrases but as a pattern. She heard rhythm where others heard noise, intention where others saw confusion. "This line here," she said, pointing, "is mistranslated. It doesn't mean the river sleeps when the hawk lands. That's not poetry. It's instruction. It means, cease surveillance after aerial drop. This isn't metaphor, it's a directive." The room stilled. Analysts stopped scribbling. Even the low hum of the fax seemed to fade. Elena's voice was calm but unshaken as she continued, unraveling the layered pun in the next phrase, a reference so obscure only someone raised in a specific Afghan province in the 1980s would recognize it. She explained it, then turned, deliberately, toward Colonel Morgan. "You'd know that one, wouldn't you, Colonel?" For the first time, her father faltered. His throat tightened, a flicker of unease breaking through his composure. He said nothing. Elena didn't smile, didn't gloat. She simply returned to her seat, her presence filling the room in a way his medals never could. And in that moment, she proved what she had always known. Her voice carried more weight than his silence ever would. After the briefing, when the others filed out, Elena stayed behind. General Langford slid a slim red folder across the table toward her, his eyes steady but grave. "Take a look," he said simply. Inside was a series of field reports, routine at first glance. Tribal elders negotiating passage. Interpreters recording assurances of peace. On paper, it all looked clean. Too clean. Elena's eyes narrowed. She read the Dari lines carefully, her finger following each syllable as though she were tracing a scar. Then she saw it. The translation did not match. The original text carried weight and warning, a clear demand for tanks to withdraw before the road was cleared. But the English version softened it to nothing more than a gesture of goodwill. "We offer water and no resistance if your men pass by sunset." It wasn't a mistake. It was a distortion. A deliberate reshaping of words into a lullaby. And 12 hours after that false report cleared, a convoy rolled through the road believing it was safe. They were met with explosives. 7 soldiers died. 2 local guides were executed. Elena's stomach tightened as she scanned the metadata attached to the transmission. Each translation carried a clearance key, an encrypted signature verifying who had authorized it. Most were generic. But this one wasn't. This one bore a personal passphrase. Her father's. It was there in plain text, embedded like a fingerprint. Wilco Eagle RF 1717. The same encryption string he had used since his early days in Kandahar. Elena's throat went dry. It wasn't forged. It wasn't borrowed. It was his. He had signed off on the distortion himself. Not by accident. Not under pressure. With surgical precision. The betrayal was undeniable. Her father hadn't just silenced her once to save his career. He had been rewriting the truth for years, altering translations, burying warnings, creating control from chaos. Every word he twisted carried the weight of blood. And this time, she could no longer tell herself he had done it for survival. He had done it for power. The deeper Elena dug, the more the language betrayed its keeper. Every altered phrase, every misplaced idiom carried a trail of fingerprints that pointed back to the same man. But nothing cut as deep as the file she almost skipped, the one dated August 14, 2020. The day Samuel died. Her hands hovered over the keyboard as though touching the file might reopen an old wound that had never healed. When she finally opened it, her breath caught. It was the situation report from the morning of his patrol. She remembered translating that intercept herself, a desperate voice warning of figures ahead, the tone laced with urgency. She had flagged it immediately as high threat. She could still hear it in her memory. Samuel's unit was walking into danger. But the archive said otherwise. The intercept now read, "No enemy presence confirmed. Area stable." Her translation, her warning, was gone. Erased. She forced herself to check the metadata. The edit had been made 12 minutes after her original submission. The clearance signature was embedded at the bottom, a block of code she could never mistake. Her father's. Colonel Richard Morgan had taken her warning and buried it under sanitized phrasing. He had overwritten the truth with silence, knowing Samuel's unit was already in motion. And minutes later, her brother was gone, killed not by the cleverness of the enemy, but by the pride of the man who had sent him forward. Elena's chest burned as she read the attached memo. Maintain operational optics. Expedite movement. Do not delay deployment based on soft reads. Soft reads. That's what her father called it. The desperate voice of a local contact begging them to hold back. The translation of a sister who had spent her life decoding urgency from breaths and broken syllables. To him, it was nothing but noise, an inconvenience to his reports, an obstacle to the clean efficiency he wanted on paper. Samuel hadn't died a soldier's death. He had been sacrificed, for optics, for image, for the career of a man who valued promotions over people. And now, staring at the proof, Elena finally understood the truth that had been gnawing at her for years. Her father hadn't just betrayed her. He had killed her brother. Elena didn't go home after finding the truth. She couldn't. The weight of the files pressed against her like a verdict waiting to be delivered. Instead, she walked the long sterile halls of the Pentagon until she reached General Langford's office. It was late, most of the building had gone quiet, but his light was still on. He looked up when she entered, and though his face betrayed no surprise, his eyes told her he already knew what she carried. Without speaking, Elena slid the flash drive across his desk. "I need to show you something," she said. Langford inserted it, and the screen filled with files, her original translations, the metadata logs, the edits, the clearance ID attached to each distortion. One by one, she laid it out, each piece fitting into a pattern too precise to be coincidence. Finally, she opened the file from August 14th, Samuel's patrol. Her warning. The erasure. The replacement. And the casualty list with her brother's name circled in red. Langford didn't interrupt. He sat with the stillness of a man who had seen too much already. When she finished, he exhaled slowly. "It was your father." "Yes," Elena answered. Her voice did not shake. For a long moment, silence hung between them. Then Langford asked the question that mattered most. "What do you want to do with this?" Elena had thought about it all night. She didn't want headlines. She didn't want cameras flashing or commentators shouting. She didn't even want revenge. What she wanted was simpler, and harder. "I want justice," she said. "Not scandal. Not spectacle. Justice. So that history won't forget men like my brother. So that no one can erase him again." Langford studied her, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. He picked up a red phone on his desk and made a single call. His voice was steady, formal, unmistakable. "Authorizing immediate review of personnel action under Title 10, Article 32. Sealed inquiry. No media. No leaks." When he hung up, he looked back at her. "You'll testify," he said. "I will." His tone softened, just slightly. "Then you'll need protection. And if the committee signs off, there will be no ceremony, no public trial, but there will be consequences." Elena stood. For the first time in years, the weight in her chest felt bearable. She hadn't asked for revenge. She hadn't asked to see her father in handcuffs. All she had asked was that Samuel's name not be lost to silence. And now, at last, justice had begun. Quiet, secret, but real. For a time, the inquiry remained in the shadows, sealed behind classified doors. Elena testified in a small, windowless room where her words were recorded but never broadcast. There were no cameras, no uniforms lined in rows, no spectators to applaud or condemn. Only silence, signatures, and the quiet machinery of justice moving where few could see. But secrets have a way of escaping. Within 3 days, the first whisper surfaced. senior intelligence officer under investigation for manipulated translations leading to fatal missions. No names, no details, but it didn't take long before the press connected the dots. Headlines exploded. Daughter betrays decorated father. Patriot or pariah. Talk shows dissected her every move. Some painted her as a traitor who had dragged a hero's name through the mud. Others called her the bravest whistleblower of her generation. She was both condemned and celebrated, often in the same breath. The hate mail came fast. Traitor. You were nothing without him. One message read simply, "Your brother should have died without you knowing. That would have been kinder." Elena read them all, then deleted them without reply. But alongside the hate came something else. Quiet letters. Messages that did not shout, but carried the weight of lived grief. A widow sent a photograph of her husband's boots beside a folded flag. "Thank you for making someone answer," she wrote. A former translator from Iraq wrote, "For years, we were told our mistakes didn't matter. You proved they did." Elena printed those letters, folded them carefully, and kept them in her wallet. They reminded her that the voices she spoke for weren't gone. They had simply been waiting for someone to listen. The world called her many things: traitor, patriot, whistleblower, betrayer. But to the families who had lost their sons to silence, she was something else entirely. Proof that the forgotten still had a voice. And for Elena, that was enough. Years passed. The storm of headlines faded, the inquiries concluded, and the world moved on, as it always does. But Elena did not disappear into silence. Instead, she built something new from the ashes of what had been taken. At West Point, she walked into classrooms filled with sharp-eyed cadets, their uniforms crisp, their notebooks eager for strategies and battle maps. They expected lessons on tactics, on weaponry, on maneuver. What Elena gave them instead were lessons on words. Understanding, she told them, pacing slowly across the lecture hall, is terrain. And terrain wins wars. The cadets scribbled her phrase, some nodding thoughtfully, others frowning as if unsure how words could ever compare to firepower. But Elena knew better. She told them of Kabul, of a boy with a cooking pot mistaken for a weapon. She told them of poetry that calmed a room full of orphans. She never once spoke her father's name, but she spoke Samuel's, letting his story live on in the air between her and her students. In the evenings, when her work was done, Elena often visited the memorial wall. It stood in quiet dignity, names etched in stone, rows upon rows of lives ended too soon. Her hand always found the same line: Samuel Morgan. She pressed her palm against the cold granite, her reflection staring back at her in the polished surface. And every time, she whispered the same words she had once used to stop Marines from pulling their triggers, words that had saved lives long ago in a dusty Kabul street. He lives, if he listens. For Elena, it was no longer just a phrase in diary. It was Samuel's legacy, her promise, and the truth she carried forward into every classroom, every lecture, every cadet who learned that war was not only about weapons or ranks but about voices heard or ignored. And in that legacy, Samuel lived on.